Welcome back. You may have noticed about 2 weeks ago I took a small hiatus just because some life stuff. So now we're back and we are looking to finish the last of our just basic editing tutorial. The last two tutorials, the first one was on how to sort, the second one was bridge editing, which actually covers most of the steps for a small project like this one. Today we're going to look at the just very basic Photoshop editing steps. They're pretty simple and discuss some starter concepts for Photoshop for those of you unfamiliar with it. So first off, you probably recognize our flower. Before we kick off the actual editing, I'm going to open it in Bridge again by clicking on this thumbnail. I'll explain how that works in a moment. Because I did not cover setting this up for print correctly in my Bridge tutorial. So what we're going to do is down here, there are these words. Mine say Pro Photo. Yours will probably say something different. Sorry, if the screen is closed, they come up blue. So we click on that, it brings up this little screen. I would suggest setting your color space because you are editing digitally to Pro Photo RGB. And this gives you the widest range of colors available, at least in a digital workspace right now, which is good because photographs are not only printed or only displayed digitally, but they're displayed both ways. So also hit 16 bits for your channel. Your crop size, there's no selection because that is determined by what you crop it to in your bridge editing. This is the crop tool up here. And we used that in the previous tutorial, so if you're unfamiliar with that, you can go back and take a look. The resolution is the big thing I want to stress here. If you plan on printing these, you should set the resolution to 300. That's the standard for photographs that will be printed. It also ensures that digitally you have enough information to work with and that a printer has enough information to print from without things looking skewed and pixelized. Sharpen for, I keep it at none because one sharpen should not control them all. Sharpening is really picky and you really should do that manually for each photograph so you don't end up with weird pixel halos and things like that. The last thing I encourage you to do is take this little check box. If it's unchecked, check it to open in Photoshop as a smart object. We touched on this a little bit in the previous tutorial, and what that does is when we open it in Photoshop as a smart object, it becomes an object that can be edited in certain ways without destroying pixels. And that's very important because the more pixel information that you have intact from your original file, the better quality you have for both digital and print. So as much as possible, we never want to destroy the pixels in the original photograph. That's the beautiful thing about Bridge, is that it's all non-destructive editing, and we're going to do a little bit of that in Photoshop as well. Now, since most of my basic editing steps happen in Bridge, this tutorial for actual Photoshop is going to be pretty simple. Later on, I plan on getting into some more complicated stuff, but this is just, steps 1 through however many on how to edit some really basic art piece like our yellow flower here. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm using CS5 because I have not as of yet obtained CS6, but this should still hopefully be helpful. Depending on how new you are to Photoshop, if your Photoshop looks different than this and you're really confused as to why, if you look up here, you see Essentials, Design, Painting. These are all preset workspaces depending on what the program thinks you need. So shock and awe, but you hit this arrow, I'm on Photography. So if things look a little confusing, switch to Photography. That should help clear things up. The other thing about Photoshop workspaces is you can grab these little doohickeys and move them around. So if things still look slightly different, that's why I've customized my space a little bit. But I will tell you what each window is as I select it and what the key commands are for them so you can find your way around with me. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the F key. F is for full screen, and what that does, it puts it on this nice gray background. It's not distracting. You have no intruding colors. All you see is what you are working with. So now, this is a pet peeve, and I like to center them a little more in between all my workspaces here. So in order to just move the entire object that you're working with around, you can just hit the space bar and hold it down, and you can drag it wherever you want. But I really just want it right here. Okay, so now it looks a lot like, well, it looks exactly like what we brought it to be in Bridge. So at this point, I start to do just a few minor almost exposure adjustments, and I also begin to adjust things like contrast. Now, for me personally, I shoot usually with black and white in mind. My portfolio is 90% black and white work. It's what I specialize in. So for me, that's kind of what my goal is here, but it will still work for color. Uh, Obviously, sometimes your numbers are going to be different than what these tutorials give you, depending on what your needs are. But for now, let's talk about some non-destructive, just contrast and exposure adjustments here. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to go down to this little circle. This is your layers panel. Actually, up here at the bottom of this is this little circle. Layers are going to contain, like, this is this. Oh, don't do that though. Don't do that either. Okay, so this little thing is this big thing. It's showing you what layer of work you're on. We only have one layer right now. So we're going to hit this circle and get this nice list here. And what you want to select is curves. I am pretty addicted to curves, as you'll find out the longer you listen to me ramble on in these tutorials. But what curves does is it's a good way to apply simple exposure adjustments. You can do a lot of other things with it, but since this is just for basic needs right now, I can give you an extreme example. Here, you can flip it into a color negative. So if this photograph was a color negative, this is what it would look like. The cool thing about this is, and I like using the extreme example, because you can go to this little eyeball here. We've created a second layer. This is the curves we just added. Notice how it's not attached to this layer, it's just sitting on top of it like that, almost like really, really old reference, but overhead transparencies. So that's kind of what it does, or how they work, I should say. So click off the eye. Our original is still there. It's intact, and it's actually untouched. So that's the beauty of the curves layer. You can do things like create negatives. You can darken, increase your contrast, lighter. You can make just a standard black negative right there. So you can kind of see in extremes here that it's not affecting the bottom photograph, but it is changing the appearance with this overlaid on the top. So what I want to do is I'm going to make some minor exposure adjustments because I feel like this is still a little dark. First I'll turn this off so you can see what we're actually working with. Get the craziness over with there. Okay, so up here in this list, these are all presets for you to use or base your stuff off of. I really like the lighter preset. It brightens things up nicely without washing stuff up too much. It's a really fast step and it works out well and nothing's blowing out. And the cool thing about it is that in the curves you can adjust things here, which I'll show you a little bit later. So it's a really cool way to do some non-destructive exposure adjustment. So now that has happened, I want to know what this is because eventually I'll have a lot of layers here and something named curves 1 is not going to be helpful. So what I'm going to do is double click on that actual title, curves 1. It should allow you to edit it once you double clicked. And I'm just going to call it lighten because that's what its job is. Okay, so once that's done, lightening it, if we turn this off, go back to the original, we can see where we've lost some contrast in these areas. Turn this back on. And A, for shooting for black and white, and B, just my personal style, I like a lot of contrast. So I actually want to pull some of that back out without darkening the photograph. We'll go back down here to our circle. I'm going to hit curves. I'm going to go back, and I'm going to go linear contrast. This is going to restore some of that contrast that we lost when we made it lighter. Look at that. Okay. Now again, something titled curves 1, if I want to come back and change this later, is not helpful. So I'm going to call it, I just put LIN contrast. That way I know what kind of contrast, because linear contrast is different than just increased contrast. So just to see what this does. Kind of restores some of the depth that was in here. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, now a lot of times I find linear contrast is really all I need, but in this case I actually want to do something a little different. And you will see why here in a moment. I'm going to come back down here to my curves. Most of my Photoshop editing is curves, sharpening, and then applying my black and white plugin, which we will go through at a later point. I want to see just a little bit more contrast here, but I don't want it to just be linear. I want it to affect everything. So I'm going to go medium contrast. Okay, so you can see this one, how it affects things a little more. I really don't want it to affect that much. But when you select a preset, it creates dots on this curves line, which is why it's called curves, because you control it by creating curves. So as an example, if I were to take this dot and pull it up this way, everything gets brighter. Not what we want at all. I'm just showing you. If we pull it down, everything gets darker. Again, not what we want. But I'm going to put that back in its home on this line. Alright, this is the one that's going to control our darker area of contrast. I don't want it quite this dark. Actually, so I'm going to grab it just by clicking it and holding it. So you move these things and you drag it. I don't want it all the way up to the original line. I just want to move it a little bit closer there. Okay, we'll go back to click on this box. If the top part of your layer's box gets covered over, you can click on the bottom and it'll bring it back up to the top. Let's take a look at that. See, that's affecting more overall. It's not just the gentle. Okay, so this I'm going to call medium contrast. Always name your layers or else you'll be very confused later as to what on earth you were doing and what on earth you should change, if anything. Okay, so now I like what's happening. There's a good amount of contrast, nothing's blowing out, but I feel like this flower is kind of blending in with everything else because we kind of have this split going on for the background. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to open up, guess what, another curves layer. But this time we're going to talk about something different. So all of these curves layers, you see them here, they have these white boxes. These are called masks. What a mask is it lets you see the effect. Now, a white mask allows you to see all the contrast we just applied. If I were to paint it all black, it would hide the effect entirely. It would be the same effect as if it were off. Sorry, this one. As if this were off. So this white box for medium contrast, each one is attached to their own layer, was all black, it would look like this instead. So I really struggled with this when I first learned masking, but if it's something you can master, it's really helpful. I don't know why I just turned that off. Okay, back up to our new one, which we haven't done anything with. I want to make the background slightly darker, and there are several ways to do this, but this is really simple. And so what I want to do, because everything is soft, you can kind of have some overlapping shadow, I'm going to hit just darker. Just going to use the preset. I usually don't use this many presets, but for this project it works really well. But now everything is darker, and we only want the background darker. So to fix this, you select, first we need to rename our layer, call it darken, that's what it's doing. Select your white box next to the darken, make sure this is what's selected, not this. This is your mask. And you're going to hit the B key. B selects your brush right here. And if you need to, you can just come click on it. That's fine, but hitting B will get you there too. Now, we're going to paint on this mask over here. It will not affect our layer because we're painting up here, not down here. This is non-destructive editing. The brush tool will use whatever color you have selected here in your palette. Now, since our mask is white and that reveals the effect and we want to hide it, part of it, we're actually going to come over here and you can either hit this arrow like this or you can hit the X key. Both will switch you to black. or whatever color's behind. In this case, it's black by default. Okay, so now I have my brush by hitting B. I have black selected by hitting X. The mask is selected here. Last thing I want to do is come up here. When you're in your brush tool, you will see the word opacity. Opacity is how much of something you are painting, or in this case, in the mask, how much you're removing. So if I turn it all the way up to 100, it would just wipe the effect clean away when we go to paint. Don't want it to go all the way away. I want a gentle transition, so I'm going to knock it down to 50. And you can do that just by selecting this and typing in 50. Alright, so you can hit enter. Once that's done, to paint, all you do, you click and you drag it around. So I'm going to click here, and what I want to do is I only want to remove the darkening effect from the flower and maybe a little of the surrounding area. My brush is a little big. In order to take care of that, I can actually go to the bracketing keys. So if you look at your keyboard, find the letter P, and then right next to the P there are two keys with brackets. The bracket on the left is to make the brush smaller. The bracket on the right is to make the brush bigger, make the brush a little smaller. Okay, so the last step here, I'm going to go up here to this little box. You can get your size here too. I prefer to use the brackets, it's faster. But I do want to check my hardness. So if I draw hardness all the way up and paint with it, it's going to leave a really harsh line. That's not what we want. It shouldn't look like we just painted with a round brush. Not at all what we want. It should be very gentle and fairly unnoticeable. We're just trying to bring the flower out of the background again. So I'm going to turn my hardness all the way down, meaning there will not be a hard line. It will be a nice gentle line. Now I'm going to paint over my flower by clicking and dragging my mouse. Like this. Kind of just bring this back out. It's okay to get the rock too in this case because we're trying to center on the subject here. Okay, so now I did that at 50%. If you want to bring it out a little more, you can go over it again. It becomes a little less harsh than doing it a full 100% the first time. We want this nice bright yellow to pop out of the rock. Okay, so now you can see here in this little mask there's this funny gray area that's showing us where we painted on the mask over here. So we want to see our effect. You can turn off the eyeball. Pops a lot more. And I actually could stand to see the background a little darker. Really easy way to do this in this situation is you click on your layer here on the picture of the curves, the darken layer. You drag it down to this little box next to the trash can. Do not drag it to the trash can. That would be sad. Drag to the box next to it and then let go and it will create a copy for you. Now that's way too dark. So we've learned about masks. We just learned how to copy a layer. Now what I'm going to do is, we talked about opacity. Since this is too dark with two of the same thing going on here, I'm actually going to come up here to this opacity because this opacity up here is for the layer you have selected. So if I select this layer and change the opacity up here, it only changes for this layer. If I do it for that, it changes for that. So we're going to change the opacity of our top layer because now the effect is too dark because we doubled it by creating a second layer, the copy layer. Okay, so I'm going to hit this and select this and hit 5. It's in half. Maybe I want it just a little less. Hit 3. Okay. Sometimes I play around with it. I do actually like 5. Okay. Alright, so just to review what we've done here, we've used a curve layer. This is all curves, so this is all non-destructive. I could get rid of all of this, and the bottom layer, our main file, has been completely untouched. Pardon the sniffles, it is still allergy season for me. I think it's always allergy season for me. Okay, so in review, we have, I'm actually going to turn these off. Go over this together. Alright, so here's our original. This is where we used a curve layer and the lighten preset to lighten the exposure. We used linear contrast to restore some of our contrast. I wanted a deeper contrast because this could potentially be a black and white, and I also like contrast a lot, even in my color. Turn that on. And the flower is falling into the background way too much. There's just way too much competition there. So we darkened it with a curve layer where we hid the effect on the flower alone, and we used the copy layer technique to double that to darken it just a little bit more. So those are really basic, all non-destructive editing steps that you can kind of play around with on anything. So you can see how the more complicated a project, you end up with a lot of layers, and then eventually you'll get a scroll bar. So that's why it's very important to name them all. And these are all adjustments, basic adjustments. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the bottom one selected. I'm going to hit the Shift key and select the top one. Selects all of these adjustment layers, but not this layer, just the adjustment layers. Now I'm going to use a key command. I'm going to use Command G or Control G if you're on a PC. What that does, they're all still there, but they're all in this handy dandy little group, and if you push this arrow, they fold up so you can see more of what's going on with your layers. If you need to see what's going on with these layers, you can open it up by pushing that arrow again. You rename a group the same way you rename a layer. Double click on that. I call this group adjustments. Okay. And the other cool thing about putting something in a group is if you want to see everything we did and the effect of all of it together on your base, you can just turn off the group. Alright, so there's one more final step that I'm going to take you through in the basic editing process. I'm going to open this up so you can see all these layers with the adjustments group selected, so it's on top here. It's a really long key command, but what it's going to do is it's going to take all of these and this and make a new layer of all of this combined. So it'll look just like this, but it will have a second layer that's all of these things, but as one layer. And I'll explain why we do that in a minute, but let's do that first. So hit Command or Control. If you have a PC, your opening is Control. Then you're going to push Alt, Function, Shift, hold all of those down, and then you're going to hit the letter E last. Gives us what I call the wheel of thinking. Alright, here's this new layer. So to show you what I mean by new layer, we're going to close this, we're going to turn off this group, and we're going to turn off our base, and this is still there. And it looks exactly the same as those two combined, but you can see that it's different if I turn off this and then turn this one on. So that's all of our efforts together in one nice neat layer. But now we're going to use this layer to sharpen our picture a little more. So with this selected, come up here, hit Filter. There are lots of different steps you can use for sharpening for different situations. The one I use probably 90% of the time though is called High Pass, and it's actually in Other. There's a sharpen area, you won't find it there. When look in Other, High Pass, it's very similar to Bridge's exact same idea. So I do it twice, once in Bridge and then once in Photoshop once I've done all my adjustments. Okay, so it brings up this weird looking thing and everything goes gray. So the first step is you want to zoom in, and to do that you're going to hit the space bar and hold your command key or your control key if you're on a PC, and then you're going to click. Brings up that little magnifying glass with the plus sign, and you're going to click till you can see these edges. They're very faint because everything's grayed out. I'm actually going to hit my space bar and drag it up here so it's more obvious. So we have some edges here and here. Kind of see what's going on. Those are the edges of our flower in the normal one and the normal photograph, not this weird gray thing. So you have a radius here. We kind of talked about the radius or the amount. No, the radius. Sorry, it's still radius in Bridge. And how it should never go above 1.0 or below 0.5. The high pass system, I work by a slightly different rule, but not much. I still try never to pull it above 1.0. At the most, I will pull it above 1.5. If you over sharpen things, you end up with strange pixel halos, and it looks very funky digitally and when you print. We don't want that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by pulling it all the way down to 0.1. You see all those edges disappeared. So very slowly, I'm going to take this, I'm going to pull it up. Ignore what's happening over here. Look at what's happening here. Okay, our edges are back at 0.8. And what we don't want to happen is if we pull it up too far, you'll see color start to appear and you see these weird halos. Don't want that. So if you're saying that, you've gone too far. Let's back it down to 1.0. Alright, so none of the color is really showing through. There's no halos. You see some slight bits of yellow, but it's very, very faint. That's what you want. So I hit OK. Alright, it's still gray. So we're going to back up now so we can see what we're doing. Hit your spacebar and then hit Alt, and it will give you the magnifying glass with a minus sign. And then you want to back it up so you can see the whole thing. Alright, still gray. So, if you look at this, make sure this is selected. First off, we're going to rename it Sharpening. Bam. Then we're going to come up here to where it says Normal. Make sure on your layers, the sharpening layer is selected. Normal. And when you hit click on that normal, it opens up this drop down list. There's a lot of different things that these blending modes do. That is an entirely different tutorial. So for now, for this tutorial, the only one you need to worry about for this step is hitting overlay. Hey, look, our picture's back. Alright, what this does is it takes the base and the high pass filter that we applied to this will actually sharpen it. That's why we have to condense everything into one. Because then when we create the overlay, it creates this gray sharpening screen and we need to be able to see this underneath. Okay, so let's hit our spacebar and either your command key or your control key. Zoom in. I'd suggest going to 100 if you need to know where you're at in the zoom percentage. Look up here. It says 33.3. Zoom in a little more and a little more and a little more. Okay. So what we're looking for, make sure there's no strange pixel halos up here, and you can check and see what the effect is by just hitting this eyeball on the sharpening layer. And you shouldn't see, it shouldn't be really extreme. It should be very subtle, but it's definitely there. See, things are a little softer there, and we hit this, and things come into focus, especially in this area more. Okay, so that's done. Has done what we want it to do. All right, at this point, if you're looking for just a nice color final, you could very well be done. The next tutorial will be bringing this into what's called a program called Silver Effects Pro. It's produced by Nick Software. It plugs straight into Photoshop, and it's a black and white conversion program. And I really wanted to showcase that. So in preparation for that, we're going to do our big command one more time. And with the sharpening layer selected, we're going to hit Command or Control, Alt, Function, Shift, hold all of those down, and then hit E. That's going to take our sharpening layer, and there we go. And then I name this Color Final. If I was not converting this to a black and white, I would not create this extra layer, but for the next tutorial, we'll need that there. And the downside to creating the extra layers is that it does, or the extra merge layers, it does add to your picture size, but for our for the ends that are in sight, this is what we need. So there you have it. We have our base, our adjustments group, sharpening, and then our color final, which will eventually be converted to a black and white. But that's just some very, very basic CS5 editing, all non-destructive and all just with curves layers and a little bit of sharpening. Hope you enjoy the tutorial, and I'll see you next week. Cheers!